Hi, hello and welcome to my channel friends. This is your Govindraj. Thank you very much for all your views, comments and likes and also subscription to my channel. And today we will talk about an important topic called annual report or return under the POSH Act, which is the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition, Redressal Act 2013. Why I came up with this topic? Because both section 21 and 22 of the Act talks about annual report. Section 21 talks about an annual report by the internal committee. Section 22 talks about annual report by the employer. So we should understand both these provisions and the associated concerns on these two important provisions of the Act for proper compliance of the Act. Before we get into the annual return or report, which needs to be submitted by the IC or the employer, let me give you all a very short brief on the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act 2013. And if you look at, there was no legislation in the country to protect the women workers from the workplace sexual harassment until the landmark judgment by the Honorable Apex Court in the year 1997. The provisions which were available under IPC, especially Section 509, were not of much use for workplace sexual harassment cases, as the offence under this section was required to be proved beyond doubts. And therefore, the Apex Court in the case of Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan used the power under Article 32 and 141 and laid down certain guidelines and norms for observance at all workplaces until the legislation is enacted for this purpose. And the Apex Court also defined what is sexual harassment and also provided detailed guidelines that need to be followed by all employers. And finally, in the year 2013, the Parliament enacted the law on this matter, and this legislation, which is the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act 2013, which came into effect from 9th December 2013. And this piece of legislation contains many provisions on the employer's obligations, the constitution of the internal committee and the local committee, the enquiry and investigation of sexual harassment complaints, and many more important provisions on this topic. And one such obligation is to submit an annual report or return. Now, whether it is the responsibility of the employer or the internal committee is our dominant question for discussion today. Or alternatively, we can also ask this question: are these separate responsibilities of IC and employer? Are there any separate responsibilities of internal committee as well as employer? And is there a requirement of these two reports? One is by internal committee and the another one is the employer. Now, if you look at section 21 of the Act, this contains provisions related to the annual report. As I told you, section 21 and 22 are important to conclude on this topic. Now, let's take the exact text of the section for our understanding and further deliberation of this section 21. See, section 21 talks about committee to submit annual report. See, this committee can be internal committee as well as the local committee, whereas the internal committee is constituted by the employer and the local committee is constituted by the district officer or district commissioner or district collector. Now, this section reads as: the internal committee or the local committee, as the case may be, shall in each calendar year prepare in such form and such time as may be prescribed an annual report and submit the same to the employer and the district officer. And going ahead, also it is another subclass: the district officer shall forward a brief report and annual reports received under subsection 1 to the state government. So we are not going to discuss about the local committee and also the role of district officer or district commissioner. We are going to discuss on internal committee and also the responsibilities of employer. See, these provisions under this section lead to certain doubts and questions as the internal committee reports to the employer. Let me tell you also why I am calling it as an internal committee. When the act was originally enacted, it was called as Internal Complaint Committee. Later, this was changed to IC, or nothing but Internal Committee. Now, for our discussion, based on this provision, for me, the 4 questions comes to my mind for discussion. First question is being, is the IC responsible to submit the report to district officer, IC or the internal committee? And next question, which is related to this, is there a separate responsibility for the employer to file an annual report under the act? And what is the form or template is my third question. And the fourth question, which we will discuss in this video, is what is the deadline by which the annual report is to be submitted, either by the internal committee or the employer. We will talk about it, whether these are 2 reports or only single report. Now let's take the first question. Is the IC, which is internal committee, responsible to submit the report to the district officer? Now, to answer this question, yes, on a plain reading of this section 21, it gives the same meaning, that the internal committee is responsible to submit the annual report to the district officer. However, friends, the employer is made responsible to monitor the timely submission of the report by the internal committee. Section 19, if you read it, it lists out obligations or duties of the employer, which also include, quote unquote, monitor the timely submission of reports by the internal committee. And read section 20 also lists out the duties and powers of the district officer, which also includes monitor the timely submission of reports furnished by the local committee. So we are not going to talk about the local committee. We will focus on our discussion on the internal committee. So based on this, friends, it can be informed that the internal committee is responsible to submit the report to the employer and to the district officer both. And it is the responsibility of the employer to monitor the timely submission of reports by the internal committee as per section 19, which lists out the duties and obligations of the employer. And if he abets or aids the contravention of the provisions of the act, then he is penalized under section 26. The internal committee or the members are not made accountable for the non-submission of the report, as this committee is constituted by the employer and also reports to the employer. Therefore, the IC is not made responsible or not penalized, whereas the employer under section 26 is made responsible for contravention. Now, the first question we have answered. The IC is responsible to submit an annual report. The employer is required to monitor the timely submission. Now, the next question which is connected, we asked, is there a separate responsibility for the employer to file the annual report under the act? The answer to this question is also, friends, is yes, because section 22 of the act provides the answer, and in my view, this is a separate report by the employer. However, it is not very clear whether this is an annual report under the act or annual report under the Companies Act 1956. So we have to infer from the provisions of this section. Let's read the exact section. So it talks about employer to include information in annual report. The employer shall include in its report the number of cases filed, if any, and their disposal under this act in the annual report of his organization, or where no such report is required to be prepared, intimate such a number of cases, if any, to the district officer. If there is no such requirement, then only intimate the number of cases to the district officer. Why is so? See, if we look at this section, it looks like the statute is referring to the annual report required to be submitted by the employer under the provisions of Companies Act 1956, even though the act does not clarify or define this in the definition clause. What information need to be included and what kind of companies are required to submit the annual report depends on the type of company, whether it is a public listed or privately held or LLP and etc. If you look at in the initial days, the annual report was not mandatory in all other companies except the public list company. But of late, this has been made mandatory to other types of companies also in case of privately held companies and even in case of LLP. But however, so far for the partnership firms, the still annual report is not mandatory. That is why the section is saying where no such report is required to be prepared, intimate the number of cases to the district officer. Why this provision is also important? Because in some of the companies, the internal committee may not be constituted because of the number of employees. If it is less than 10 employees, then the employer is not obligatory to constitute the internal committee. Therefore, it looks like in this objective, this provision is brought. Therefore, in my view, the statute used these wordings where no such report is required to be prepared. And now if you look at also, it is mandatory for all private companies, as I said, to include compliance of this act in the annual report of the company. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs amended the Companies Account Rules 2014, and due to this amendment, the companies are now mandated to disclose compliance report of sexual harassment cases in their annual reports, failing which they can be penalized. The employer is made responsible for the violations of the provisions of this act, which is POSH Act under section 26, and violation of provisions of section 22 is particularly mentioned. So therefore, and the repeated offences can also lead to cancellation of business licenses. So we have answered both important question number 1 and question number 2, and there are separate responsibilities of annual report under section 21 and section 22. Now let's come to another question. What is the form or template to be used for the purpose of annual report? See, even though section 21 says form to be prescribed, I highlighted this. There is no such form prescribed by the rule making government, which is the central government, for the purpose of this. However, if you look at Rule 14 of the Central Rules of 2013 specifies that details can be included in the annual report by the IC as the case may be. Rule 14 specifies what are the particulars to be mentioned in the report. Therefore, I am saying accordingly the format can be developed by the internal committee or the company. Now let's take our important, the fourth and final question. What is the deadline by which annual report is to be submitted? See, if you look at the provisions of the rules as well as the act, the time limit is not specified as said both in the act and the rules framed under the act, even though section 21 says such time as may be prescribed. However, friends, in general, it should be submitted on or before 31st of January every year or within a reasonable time. So this is the conclusion which I make on all these 4 questions. And on the act, I can make one conclusion. It is a very good legislation to protect the women folks from the workplace sexual harassment, but with certain flaws due to lack of clarity, and people like us have to infer certain interpretation for proper compliance. Now the question time, friends. See, the appropriate government under section 25 can authorize or appoint an officer to inspect any workplace or establishment in relation to sexual harassment and submit the report to appropriate government. The question for all of you is such an officer is authorized and notified in your state? If yes, who is the authority or officer? Find out for your state and write in the comment box. I will be happy to reply to your comment. I will not be able to give you an answer for every state, but I can definitely give you an answer for the state of Karnataka. Now please permit me to sign off, friends. I will come back with new topics and new videos in the days ahead. If this video has added value to you, has increased your knowledge, please don't forget to like this video, comment, share it to whomever you want, and subscribe to the channel. And thank you all, and see you soon, friends.